So today we are going to be talking about the Fool's Journey. I am both very excited to talk about this topic as well as slightly intimidated because as I started taking some notes for what I wanted to cover with you guys today, I already kind of knew this, but when I started taking the notes, I realized this is a huge topic to try to cover in one, hopefully under an hour workshop. So there's no way we're going to be able to cover everything. This is something we could talk about endlessly, but I hope we can at least go through some information that might be interesting or might be helpful to you for your own tarot practice. So let's start by talking about what the Fool's Journey even is. What is the Fool's Journey? So at the base level, the Fool's Journey, I'm looking at my notes if you see me looking over here, is a metaphor for understanding the tarot, specifically the major arcana. So usually when you look at explanations of the Fool's Journey, they do focus on the majors. I don't think it has to be only focused on the majors, but that's usually when you see people talking about the Fool's Journey, that's what they're focused on. And that's what we're going to focus on today. So it's not to say that the minor arcana is not equally as important, and it's not to say that that is not part of the Fool's Journey, but this particular framework usually focuses more on the major arcana. And it is a major arcana which uses a framework in which the Fool represents you, your spirit, in search of experience. That's the simplest explanation of what the Fool's Journey is. There is no such thing as one definitive outline of the Fool's Journey. Every single tarot reader you talk to is going to have their own perspective, their own interpretation. But that is the underlying basis is always the same, that the framework is the Fool is a soul in search of experience. That particular quote about the Fool being a soul in search of experience actually comes from none other than Arthur Edward Waite himself, co-creator, of course, of the iconic and very influential Waite-Smith Tarot. Okay, so the other thing I want to mention about just kind of the big picture idea of what the Fool's Journey is usually when we're talking about the Fool's Journey, it's with the idea that the world is not necessarily the final destination because the Fool's Journey is very cyclical, but the world is sort of the ultimate ideal of being in an integrated state. The world is the place where you have reached this place of wholeness and some type of sense of connection between the various disparate elements of who you are and of your own journey. So the world is very important in the whole overall process. It kind of contains everything. It's this wholeness, right? Okay, so let's talk about where this concept came from. Where did the concept of the Fool's Journey come from? You'll notice that in our kind of modern times, people talk about the Fool's Journey as though it's just sort of a given. It's just something you see all over the place in books from different tarot teachers. But this, I think it's really important to kind of look back and think about like, where did this come from and kind of give credit where credit is due. So I want to give a shout out to Eden Gray. Eden Gray was a tarot author back in like the 60s. And she's someone you don't hear quite as much about now in our modern times, but I think that her work was actually super influential, so I want to give a shout out to her. Someone asked, is there any connection between the Fool and the Saturn return? I'm not sure. I'm assuming you're talking about the Fool's Journey and a Saturn return. I would probably not be the best person to answer that because I always consider myself a perpetual astrology newbie. So that would be a good question for someone who has more of a backing in astrology. Maybe someone will want to chime in the comments, or maybe not. But yeah, okay, so back to talking about Eden Gray. I have one of her books. It's on my screen, it's showing up backwards. I don't know how it's going to look for you guys, but this one is called Mastering the Tarot. I bought this through a used bookstore, and it still has like that used book smell, which I don't know. Is it just me? Does anybody else like the smell of used books? I like it. Yeah, so this one came out in the 60s. And so a lot of the information that I've learned about Eden Gray came from Mary K. Greer's blog. If you guys are interested in learning more about Eden Gray, she had a very fascinating life. And if you Google Mary K. Greer, Eden Gray, Fool's Journey, Mary K. Greer has kind of a little biography that she wrote up about Eden Gray's life. And it's so fascinating. I definitely recommend taking a look at that. She was an actress. Apparently she was in a movie with Ronald Reagan. She's kind of just a fascinating person all around, but she is who we owe the term the Fool's Journey to. She is the first person who coined that term, the Fool's Journey. Now, it is likely that she was inspired by that quote I shared earlier from Arthur Edward Waite, where he said, the fool is a soul in search of experience. But Eden Gray is the one who really gave us that idea of the Fool's Journey, which is now just everywhere. It's just kind of this commonly accepted thing in the realm of tarot. So I want to read you a quote from one of Eden Gray's books. She said, "The fool represents the soul of every man who, after it is clothed in a body, appears on earth and goes through the life experiences depicted in the 21 cards of the major arcana, sometimes thought of as archetypes of the subconscious. Let each reader use his imagination and find here his own map of the soul's quest, for these are symbols that are deep within each one of us." And I love that idea of it being an invitation for each of us to find our own understanding of the Fool's Journey. Like I said earlier, there's not a definitive outline that you have to adhere to. This is something that can be really personalized to what works for you. Okay, but that is another kind of underlying thing with when you look at concepts of the Fool's Journey, that generally they go through all 21 cards, again with that framework of the Fool being you, being your soul, going into each of those cards and looking at each of those cards with the framework of what experience, what lessons are you going through with that particular archetype, with that particular card. Okay, every time I talk a lot, my throat gets dry, so I'm going to drink a little water. I will, if you guys stick around to the end, I will take questions at the end, but if you're here live, you're welcome to drop in comments or questions as we're going along as well, but just so you know, there will be some dedicated time for that in a bit. Okay. All right, let's see. I'm looking at what else I wanted to talk about. Okay, so the heart of what I'm going to do with you guys here today is I'm going to share a sample interpretation of the Fool's Journey. And I'm going to do that using the deck that I co-created with Annie Rugit, the Spacious Tarot. So in a moment, I'll turn the camera around and we're going to go through all the 21 cards in the major arcana. And I'm just going to give you some of my ideas about how they fit into this framework of the Fool's Journey. As I'm talking about this, and as you continue to think about this concept for yourself, I really encourage you to take it beyond, what you hear me say or what you read in other interpretations of the Fool's Journey, and try to personalize it. Try to think about how it makes sense to you. A lot of times you'll notice in interpretations of the Fool's Journey, people tap into other ideas and connect it to other frameworks for spiritual development. For example, some of you might be familiar with the idea of the hero's journey. The hero's journey was a concept that was outlined by Joseph Campbell, who studied myths from various time frames and various cultures around the world, and essentially found that these various myths carried similar themes. There was sort of this similar core journey that these heroes went on. You can see some echoes, some resonance of the hero's journey in the Fool's Journey. Even in the titles, there's kind of a connection between the titles there. And so that's just one example. Another thing that resonates with me personally is Carl Jung's concept of individuation. The concept of individuation is essentially a journey towards wholeness, a journey towards integration. So that connects perfectly with what the Fool is moving towards as the Fool moves through all of the major arcana, ultimately into that experience of the world. The world really makes sense with that idea of individuation. So as you hear me sharing some of my ideas about the Fool's journey, there's a couple of echoes of the hero's journey as well as the framework for individuation. But as you're thinking about some personal resonance for yourself with the Fool's journey, again, you might want to expand that and think about, are there certain sort of belief systems or, spiritual frameworks or even religious frameworks that you already practice or already resonate with, and how can you tie those into the Fool's journey? So I love making it something that's really personal to each one of us. Okay. How are we doing so far? People who are here live, how are we doing? Hopefully good. I told you guys this last time if you were here last week, but it's always like, I always feel a little bit nervous doing a live. It's kind of strange. I'm getting more comfy with it, but it's a bit odd. Okay, I see hearts. I see thumbs up. Oh, hi, Nick. Nick says this is amazing. Thank you. Awesome. Okay, guys, I appreciate the votes of confidence. Sometimes I need it. All right, thanks, guys. Okay. Let's see. Oh yeah, I know. Before I start going into the actual cards, one more thing I wanted to mention, just because this came to my mind just yesterday. So I am reaching just a quick kind of diversion for a bit of a humble brag, you could say, but I am within the next few days coming up on my 7-year anniversary of starting my business and starting my blog and starting to share tarot stuff online, which is pretty exciting. And so something I've been doing lately is looking back on some of the videos and blog posts that I wrote really early on when I first started blogging. And I came across one yesterday that I was like, oh my gosh, this is so perfect to come across this again, because it ties into what I want to talk about today with the Fool's Journey. And it was this video I made where I laid out my 21 major arcana cards in a spiral pattern. And I talked about how usually when I see the Fool's Journey outlined in books, it's outlined in a linear fashion. But I talked about how I really like looking at them in this spiral pattern. And in that video, I used 2 metaphors, which I still really like now. One is I talked about the process of the Fool's Journey being almost like climbing a mountain, in terms of that you're spiraling around. So you might come upon the same lesson, the same card multiple times, but you're always coming at it from a slightly different vantage point, because you're sort of doing that circular process, right? And then the second thing is I also thought of it, I used the metaphor as of a game of chutes and ladders, because although I really like the order of the major arcana, I think there's a sort of divine sense to the order of the major arcana. It's not meant to be prescriptive. It's not meant to say we always go in this kind of linear fashion and learn the lessons in this order. Depending on your unique life circumstances, you might sort of be forced to learn a certain lesson, maybe from the very end of the major arcana very early in life. And so all I'm saying is this, none of this is meant to be specific. It's meant to just be this general framework to give you some things to think about. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, I think we are ready. What I'm going to do now, let's see, someone says, love that perspective. Nothing is truly linear all of the time. That's so true. Yes, everything is always dynamic, and we're going to talk about that more as we start going through this. All right, my dears. So this is going to be, I hope not too clunky. I really need to get a tripod one of these days. My phone is always propped up on, be surprising to no one, but a stack of tarot books and some crystals. That's what's holding my phone up. So let's turn the camera around so we can look at the cards together. Let's see, I think that's how we do it. Okay, and let me see. Give me just a second so I can get this. at a place where we can see. I think I wanted to put it, oh yeah. Sorry guys, bear with me. This is what happens when we're live. We just got to make do. Hopefully the books aren't too distracting. Can you guys see that okay? I think that looks all right. We'll make do with that. You can see my book stack here, but it's good enough. Okay, so let's start going through a sample interpretation of the Major Arcana. Again, this is the Spacious Tarot, the deck I co-created with Annie Rugit. We're going to use this for our exploration. Okay, people are saying you can see okay. Thanks, guys. Cool. Okay, so we begin with the Fool, which again, the Fool represents you. The Fool is you as a soul in search of experience. The Fool is card 0, which is very significant because as card 0, the Fool can be nowhere and everywhere at the same time. I think of the Fool as limitless. There's no boundaries with the Fool. The Fool is the part of you that transcends your specific consciousness in your specific body in this specific lifetime. So we took a lot of cues, of course, from the Waite-Smith Tarot with our depiction, this idea of moving into this vast expanse of, I think of this beautiful, like expansive sky and just opening into that idea of experience without any preconceived notion, just moving into that experience. Okay, so we have the Magician. The Magician is your conscious awareness. The Fool coming into the limitless energy of the Fool is now channeled into a more specific form. That's what we see with the Magician. The Magician is also about generally what it means to operate in the realm of this earthly reality. So this is another one where with our depiction, there's a lot of cues from the Waite-Smith Tarot in terms of, I sort of think of the perspective as you are the magician and you're sort of here in the middle, the ground's below you, and you're looking up, and these 4 tools of the Major Arcana are in that central location. So it's that idea of as above, and then the lemniscate here, and then you sort of taking these tools of the earthly realm and channeling that energy into something specific here in the material plane. And then the other thing I wanted to mention about the Magician is this is the Fool learning what it is to be in active energy, to be doing. Okay. Then we have the High Priestess. So while the Magician and the High Priestess, of course, kind of form a pair, right? There's a few cards in the tarot that form a pair. So the High Priestess is about your unconscious awareness. The Fool finding out what it is to have an unconscious awareness, whereas with the Magician, it's conscious awareness. Of course, intuition is present here. There's a lot of mystery in the High Priestess, and the High Priestess is about knowledge that is more subtle, which is why it ties into intuition, sometimes even knowledge that is hidden. The way that we've shown it in the Spacious Tarot, a lot of people think that this is a pearl, and if that's how you interpret it, that's fine. But what we meant it to be is a reflection of the moon. So the idea here is the shell is this vessel, this container, this mysterious depth, and there's ocean water here in the shell, and then you're seeing a reflection of the full moon here in the shell. So while the Magician is active, the High Priestess is passive. The High Priestess is receptive. The Fool learning what it is to be. The Magician what it is to do. The High Priestess what it is to be. Okay, give me 1 second. Drink some more water. Okay, so we have the Empress. And this I want to be, I'm going to try to phrase this as best as I can because, let's see, someone says with the High Priestess, I find it interesting that it could be a pearl. I've always seen a moon, but I love the imagery of a pearl as well. Thank you for saying that because it's weird being the person who co-created the deck. I'm always hyper aware of, I don't want to say the way that I see it is how everyone else should see it. I love that someone could see a pearl in that, and that is completely valid. So I appreciate you sharing that. Okay, so with the Empress, like I was saying, I want to be careful of how I talk about this because there is this idea with the Empress and the Emperor that archetypically they do represent mother and father. But I want to make it really clear that that's archetypical and it's metaphoric. So there can sometimes be this idea of, all of us in whatever capacity literally have parents, we come from other human beings, but I don't like getting too tripped up on like gender or traditional gender roles or anything like that with these cards. So again, metaphoric, archetypical idea of mother. So the Empress, sorry, I'm getting a phone call. That's distracting. Let's just decline that. Sorry guys. Okay. So one of the ways that we tried to tie in the imagery in the spacious tarot is we have flowers, and a lot of the flowers we chose here were intentionally chosen because they are healing, they are nurturing. So we have things like lavender, yarrow, this one's echinacea in my mind, and then there's even these little berries kind of in the corner. So there's this idea of abundance in the earthly realm. We talked about mother as a metaphor, so this can even be the idea of mother nature, not just about mothering in the human sense. And then another really big thing with the Empress is the Empress tends to things as they exist organically, but there's also to me, there's always some type of protective energy to the Empress as well, which is why we chose to include the eagle in the card. It's not just all softness, there's a fierceness to the Empress as well that I think sometimes goes a little bit overlooked. Okay. And then, of course, just like the Magician and the High Priestess have a natural pair, the Empress and the Emperor have a natural pair as well. So here we have, again, metaphoric, archetypical father energy. So the Emperor has more of an order, with the imagery in the spacious tarot, there's this sprawling wildflower field with the Empress, whereas with the Emperor, there are these poppies that are very intentionally cultivated and planted in rows. So there's more of an order, more of a structuring that happens with the Emperor. Poppies can be a symbol of war. So that's one sort of symbolic thing about the poppies being shown here. And there's this idea with the Emperor of bringing things into line, sort of planning things to grow to your specifications. And just like with any card, that can be for better or for worse. Okay. All right. So then we have the Fool in search of experience, now reaching the Hierophant. So this is where the Fool is starting to have to come to an acceptance that they live in a society, right? Just like the meme, we live in a society. Someone says, you're loving getting, thank you so much. I feel like I'm really bumbling over it. I'm not on my 100% A game today, but I'm doing the best I can. So I'm glad it's coming over at least somewhat decently for you guys. So, again, like the meme says, we live in a society, and the Hierophant is representative of the society. So there is the idea of religion in the Hierophant. In older decks, this card was known as the Pope, but to me, that's only one aspect of the Hierophant. It can also be about education, social order and structures, belief systems of the group, any kind of sort of group identity marker is represented in the Hierophant. Eventually, with the Hierophant, there is a space created for the Fool to form their own belief system, which may be informed by the group belief system that they've been sort of raised with, but it may also require some unlearning of that. The reason that we chose the stone circles to show in the Spacious Tarot is we do not know with any certainty what ancient people used these stone circles for. We can imagine, we can speculate, we can have theories, but there's not a definitive answer to that question. So they're a really nice metaphor for giving you the ability to use them in whatever way you need to use them. Someone says, I love this and seeing more of the deck. I'm realizing I haven't pulled some of these ever using this deck. Oh, wow. I'm glad you're enjoying it. It's kind of funny because last week, if any of you guys were here when I talked about the 4 styles of reading tarot, one of the styles of reading tarot is the magical approach. And I mentioned with the magical approach, you actually don't even have to be doing readings. It can encompass any number of ways of working with your decks. And I think doing this, like going through the cards and talking about the Fool's Journey, is a really good example of like a magical style of using tarot. We're not doing a reading. We're kind of just going through the cards face up, but we're still getting something beneficial from it. Okay, so let's move on. It's getting so cloudy outside my window, but I think we can still see the cards okay. All right, so now the Fool reaches the Lovers. So this is the experience of personal relationships of all types, not just romantic. It can be, about romantic relationships, but that's really just one angle of the Lovers. This can be about any type of interpersonal relationships. And there's also, in older decks, it was very focused on with the Lovers that there's an element of choice with this card as well. That isn't something that I always resonate with the Lovers, but I do think it's an interesting thing to think about. And I think it can be bridged with the concept of personal relationships, because with the Lovers, the Fool is realizing that they have to make some choices about what other energetic beings they surround themselves with. So be that, people that they have relationships with, friendships with, whatever. What we were going for with the imagery here in the Spacious Tarot is actually just beams of light. So more of sort of an ethereal, energetic way of showing the message of the Lovers. A lot of people have said they see DNA in this, which to me is just a really nice synchronicity, because that isn't something that I intentionally thought about when I came up with this concept, but I love that idea also resonates with this card as well. Someone says, Rachel Pollack investigates the Fool's Journey with deep insight in her book, The Forest of Souls. Ooh, I need to get that one. I have 78 Degrees of Wisdom. I talk about that one all the time. I read Tarot Wisdom several years ago. I got it actually from the library, but I just bought that one. But I've never read The Forest of Souls, so thank you for that recommendation. Okay. Let's go ahead and move on. So we have the Chariot. Okay, speaking about Rachel Pollack, since someone just mentioned her, this is something else I was going to mention earlier and I forgot, but another framework that I turn to a lot for working with the major arcana that kind of overlaps with the Fool's Journey comes from Rachel Pollack, where she has this method of laying out the major arcana in 3 rows of 7 cards. And if you look at the major arcana in that framework, the Chariot is the last card in that first row. I think of that first row as talking about traditional human development. So I'm going to leave it there for now because we could go on a whole tangent about that. But I just wanted to mention that because that framework does inform the way that I look at the major arcana and the Fool's Journey. Okay, so we have the Chariot. So when the Fool reaches the Chariot, the Fool is now coming firmly into a sense of ego identity. The Chariot is when you come into a very strong sense of your ego self. Now, people sometimes in the spiritual realm tend to use the word ego as synonymous with something very bad, something we need to get rid of. That is not how I see the ego. The ego is just one aspect of ourself. So that's the thing with the Chariot, is having a strong sense of ego identity can be really good and useful. This is about really declaring, like, this is who I am, this is how I identify, and sometimes we need to have that strong sense of identity. The thing with the Chariot is sometimes we can cling and double down or think that those types of ego identity markers are the full story of who we are, and that's where the Fool runs into trouble with the Chariot, but there's a lot of positive things about the Chariot as well. So, for better or for worse with the Chariot, the way we've shown the imagery here is it's almost like you're going against the current. You're really in this sense of, this is who I am, this is what I'm going towards, this is what I'm doing. And that can be very beneficial to be in that sort of forceful energy, but it can be, something to watch out for, which is really true of any of the cards. Healthy ego and balance, exactly. Okay, so let's talk about strength. Now, this is something that I don't think is as common. There's certain cards I talked about where they naturally make a pair and it sort of just is accepted, like the High Priestess and the Magician. They just make sense together. Not everybody thinks of the Chariot and strength as a pair, but when I learned tarot, which was originally through Joan Bunning, she does talk about the Chariot and strength as having somewhat of a relationship and going together. So that's something that's really informed my understanding of these two cards. The biggest connection between these two to me is that the Chariot is about firm control, whereas strength is about soft control. Another thing that's important to mention about strength is with that framework of the 3 rows, this is where the Fool is now moving into the second row of the major arcana. And the second row is going into a deeper maturity. So strength is the beginning of a deeper maturity, a deeper understanding of challenges, a more nuanced understanding of how to approach difficult things in life. With strength, the Fool is now just beginning to understand the concept of their own shadow, as well as beginning to understand how deep their inner reserves really go. So this is one of the reasons we chose the cactus. It's this idea that the cactus can hold on to water even in this somewhat difficult environment, right? Okay. All right, so we have the Hermit here. With the Hermit, the Fool is now beginning to have a deeper understanding of who they are outside of the prescriptive realm of some of the earlier cards. So for example, with the Hierophant, there's often more of an idea of being told who we are by some type of group identity markers. And the Hermit is the beginning of doing some deeper questioning of some of those things. There's also, this isn't something I always see talked about with the Hermit, but for me, there's always a little bit of an aspect of shadow work with the Hermit. That's one of the reasons that we chose to have this dark forest clearing for the Hermit. You're beginning in the Hermit to do some introspection and find things about yourself that have been hidden. And with this lantern, bringing some illumination to those things. Usually for me, this is just kind of my personal thing, but with the Hermit, it's more about the aspect of shadow work where the Fool or you as the soul in search of experience are finding really beautiful things, kind of hidden treasures about yourself. So it's a really it can be scary, there is that darkness, but it's also, again, that idea of finding these hidden treasures within yourself. And then one more thing I want to mention about the Hermit, I talked earlier about the hero's journey, and there is an aspect on the hero's journey where the hero comes into touch with a supernatural aid or a mentor. And this is one example of a place where the Fool's journey can kind of overlap with the hero's journey. I usually think of the Hermit as being an aspect of yourself, but sometimes the Hermit is experienced as a teacher who helps you tap into new aspects of yourself, a mentor. So the Hermit can have that aspect as well. Okay. Oh, that one's a little bit dark, but all right. So we have reached the Wheel of Fortune. One thing I wanted to start by mentioning about this is there's another framework. This is something I'm not as versed in. It's not something I've really worked too much in, but I talked about these 3 rows of 7 that Rachel Pollack works with. There's another way of looking at the major arcana where you essentially split them in half. And if you look at it that way, the Wheel of Fortune is the turning point. So I just wanted to throw that in as another potential idea that might resonate with some of you for understanding the Fool's journey through the major arcana. So the Wheel of Fortune is when to me, one of the core lessons of the Wheel of Fortune is when the Fool, or you as the soul in search of experience, really has to come to an understanding of the things that you can change and the things that you cannot change. One of the reasons we chose to show this is sort of the seasons cycling here, almost the wheel of the year, so to speak, is that is an idea of something that with your ego, with your sense of control, you cannot influence. This is a broader universal shift that just happens. So the Fool really has to learn, where can I exert my free will to make things happen, to create change, versus where do I need to learn to accept change that is simply happening, that is simply part of the cyclical nature of life. Something we talked about earlier is the idea that everything is dynamic. And I talked about the old video I had of laying out the major arcana cards in a spiral. This is one of several cards in our deck where we incorporated that spiral imagery. Because it's that idea of also the Fool now starting to realize, you know what, nothing is actually static. Everything is always dynamic. Okay. Okay. So we have Justice. Are those still? Yeah, you can see those. Okay, so a couple of things with Justice that to me are some of the big themes with this one. This is where the Fool is in a very, very big sort of spiritual sense, realizing that you have to take ownership for the impact of your actions. Every action has an impact. There are always ripple effects. Sometimes those are visible very clearly here in the material plane. Other times they are more, they are something you can't necessarily see because they are spiritual, but everything has an energetic impact. That's why we chose this particular imagery for our Justice card. And something else that's big to me with the Justice card is this is where the Fool also begins to realize that being in one of the reasons we have the little black and white kind of stone here at the middle is I think this is the point where the Fool realizes that it's not really helpful to be in an all or nothing approach. There has to be some room for nuance, and there also has to be a combination of truths that you can know sort of scientifically or logically, and truths that you know in your heart, truths that you know in more of a spiritual sense. Those are both here in the Justice card as well. All right, we have reached the Hanged One. If you guys are not familiar with the Spacious Tarot, you will have noticed by now that there's a few cards where we've chosen very different imagery than what you see in the Waite-Smith system. There's some, of course, like the Fool is very inspired by the Waite-Smith system. This is probably one of the ones in our deck that is the most different just from an imagery perspective. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why. For me, one of the core things with the Hanged One is this is when the Fool experiences a dark night of the soul. That is one of the reasons we chose this darkness, kind of out here in outer space. And then another huge thing with the Hanged One, and this is a really common interpretation, it's just not usually shown so viscerally through the imagery, is the idea of shifting your perspective and realizing that the Fool realizing that the way they have been perceiving things, the way that they have been framing things or understanding things, was limited in some way and needed to be flipped, needed to be turned upside down, needed to be zoomed out, needed to be expanded. So that's a big thing with this card. And there's also a really big theme with this card. Someone says this card is amazing. Thank you. I'm so glad you think so. It's one of my favorites. A lot of people say it's one of their favorites, which is really cool because when we first showed people this card, I was so nervous. I was like, oh my gosh, no one's going to get it. They're going to think it's so weird. So I'm really glad that some people like the way that we did that one. Thank you guys. So one more thing I want to say about this one is there's also a liminality to the Hanged One. You're not here and you're not there. And it can be really uncomfortable. Like I talked about that idea of the dark night of the soul. It can be quite an uncomfortable place to be when you're in that liminal space. So one of the big lessons the Fool learns with the Hanged One is the idea of the paradox of finding a way to be comfortable with discomfort. We have to find a way to be comfortable with discomfort. I love that it makes one feel in awe. I really like that too. I'm glad you get that. It's sometimes, and this kind of tying it into the Fool's journey, you can kind of go along for so long just being like, kind of living your life and being stuck in certain stories. And one of the reasons I love the imagery of seeing the Earth from the moon is, even in a scientific sense, it just zooms you out and makes you realize, like, what are the odds that you would be alive on this planet at this time in this vast, vast universe? It's just incredible when you really think about it from that different perspective. So I'm glad that you guys like that one. All right, so now we have reached death. And, this is always, always, always said, but this is not necessarily about literal death, because a lot of times in a spiritual sense, there's not even really such a thing as literal death. Energy is just transformed. It can't be created or destroyed, right? So with death, the big thing that I think about with this card in terms of the Fool's journey is, we talked with the Chariot about really doubling down on ego identities. Death is the end of certain ego identities. So it's more about ego death. It's more about sort of detaching yourself from being so fixated on ego identities, and that doesn't have to always mean getting rid of them entirely. It can be more about getting rid of your attachment to them and acknowledging that you are something more than that, and you kind of have to shed that attachment to those. I've shared this quote like a million times. This is from 78 Degrees of Wisdom by Rachel Pollack, but I really love what she says about the death card. She says that it's not necessarily about transformation, which is a keyword a lot of people use with the death card. What it's actually about is the exact moment that you give up the old masks and allow the transformation to take place. So giving up the old masks, shedding the old skin, to move towards transformation, which is kind of what the imagery is going for here. Someone says they love my TikTok about this. Thank you so much. I basically got TikTok famous from that. I had like 15,000 views on that on my TikTok, which in my mind is like, I'm TikTok famous now. So if anyone wants my autograph, let me know. I'm just joking, but yeah, that was fun that people liked that one. Okay. So we have reached Temperance. It's funny because I'm looking at my notes about this card and I just wrote paradox, but I didn't really expand on why. But I do want to talk about that paradox is something that is huge in a lot of spiritual practices, and it's something that's really huge for me. And it's basically just an acceptance that two things which seem to be opposite, like fire and ice, can actually both be true, both exist, both be valid at the same time. So to me, that's one of the big spiritual lessons that the Fool learns in this part of the journey, is two conflicting things, two things that seem to be irreconcilable actually can exist at the same time. And sometimes they can even come together in sort of this alchemical process to form something new, which is the smoke being formed here. It's funny because I am not really at all familiar with the Thoth. I don't even know if I'm saying it right. But as I was writing my notes on Temperance, I wrote, finding the balance that is right for you. Temperance is an art. And when I wrote that sentence, temperance is an art, something in the back of my head was like, wait, I think that's what it's actually called in the Thoth deck. And so I Googled it and I was like, oh yeah. So I don't know, again, I'm not that familiar with that system, so I can't go into details as to why, but so I might be totally off, maybe it's nothing to do with how I'm viewing it, but I do think temperance is an art because it takes patience. It takes practice. The Fool really has to have a willingness to practice, to make mistakes in order to be in this place of temperance. It is not an easy place to be. Oh, someone says their connection keeps cutting out. I hope it's not my internet. Oh, it might be though. Sorry about that. Okay, well, I'm going to keep going and I'll just hope it's doing okay for the rest of y'all. One more thing I was going to mention. Temperance is now the end of row 2. If you're looking at that 3-row system I mentioned from Rachel Pollack. So this is the closing of row 2, and with the Devil, we move into row 3. Row 3 is, I call this the cosmological significance row, because this is where, in row 2, you do go into some introspection and some pretty deep things, but in row 3, you'll really start to go into some transcendental stuff. Oh, you have a good connection? Oh, good. Thanks, guys. Thank you for letting me know. Okay. All right. So, one of the things I want to talk about with the Devil, this is something that it's so funny creating your own deck because you learn so much about tarot, and something that I did not consciously think about, but I've recently realized. I want to grab this one. Oh, I don't know. Okay. Probably this is just kind of clunky, but I want to show you that we have the Hermit. So the imagery is kind of this dark forest, and then we have the Devil. And when I came up with the concept for these 2 cards, I wasn't thinking like, oh, there's kind of a connection in that imagery, but now I'm like, oh yeah, duh, there totally is. They sort of have a similar vibe to them. And even though that wasn't something I did on a conscious level, I think unconsciously I was tapping into something, because as I was getting ready to talk about this today, I talked about the Hermit being sort of the beginning of shadow work, and the Hermit is more this idea of finding things that are really luminous and really nice within your shadow, whereas I think the Devil is the continuation of shadow work, and this is the trickier part of shadow work, because I want to mention, in case you're not familiar with shadow work, this is a Jungian concept. So at the beginning I talked about how the Fool's Journey also ties into Carl Jung's concept of individuation, and shadow work is, in the simplest form, it is just acknowledging things about yourself that you cannot see, that are unconscious, that are hidden, that you would rather not see. So those can be good things, those can be beautiful things, or they can be tricky things, they can be ugly things. Like I said, they can be things you don't want to see, which is more of the Devil side of shadow work. But I do think it's interesting that, to me, there's that connection between the Hermit and the Devil. There's also a kind of connection in the themes between these 2 cards, in that there's a sense of solitude in the Hermit, but in the Devil there's a sense of isolation. And those things can be sort of similar, but they're very different in how they are experienced. So the Devil is where the Fool experiences things like shame, disconnection, not in a sense of like I'm connecting further into myself, which is more of the Hermit, but really just a disconnection and isolation. And part of the reason we chose this very straight line of trees is it's almost like you're stuck behind a fence, or even like a prison wall. It's this idea of like feeling there's something preventing you from liberation, there's something preventing you from moving forward. So there's a lot of tricky things going on with this card. I've been thinking about the Devil a lot lately. I might have to do like a whole post going into a bunch of things about the Devil, because it's just been on my mind. Okay, there's that. Okay, so now the Fool reaches the Tower, and with the imagery that we chose in the Spacious Tarot, there's this idea that a lot of times when you are out hiking or something like that, people put up these piles of rocks they call cairns, and they're essentially there to mark the path, to mark a well-trodden path. So the idea with our tower is that cairn is in the process right now of being knocked over by the lightning. Let's see. Okay, people are asking some questions. Let me try to scroll up a little. I love when connections appear between things. Your knowledge about this is incredible. Thank you. I'm glad that it's interesting for you. And then someone asked if the devil could be about addiction. And I would say yes. I'm not going to go into a lot of details on that right now because we don't have time, but that is a lot of books and texts and people who talk about tarot talk about some themes of addiction with the devil. So I think that's part of it. Okay, going back to the tower. So I was talking about the cairns. Those are being blown away. I talk about this in the guidebook for the Spacious Tarot. But there's this idea with the tower that the old paths, the old ways that you were existing and going about your life are no longer available to you when you reach the tower. So another note that I wrote, and I'm like, sometimes I look at my notes, I'm like, what was I thinking when I wrote this? But I wrote, the tower is what happens when you go through the lessons of death, but act like you haven't gone through the lessons of death. And now that I'm rereading that, I kind of get what I was thinking. So I talked about with death that it's like shedding these ego identities, but sometimes even after we've maybe dipped into that process of shedding an old way of being, those old patterns are so ingrained that we try to go back to them either because they're comfortable or because they're just what we know or whatever. And the tower is sometimes what happens when we try to go back to those old patterns, but the universe is like, no, that is not available to you. That way of being is not available to you. So the tower is another one that can be explosive and can be kind of unpleasant, but it's also very important because it clears away things that are not available to you so that you really have to find the things that are available to you. With the moon, there is one of the major themes to me is the Fool realizing that their state of consciousness is only one possible state of consciousness. This is one of the reasons that we chose to use mushrooms in the Spacious Tarot imagery. I talk about this a little bit in the guidebook as well, but mushrooms are fascinating to me for so many different reasons. Sometimes, certain mushrooms, you eat them and they're actually nourishing. Certain mushrooms, you eat them and they're poisonous and they will literally kill you. Certain mushrooms, you eat them and they will alter your consciousness. Mushrooms also don't need sunlight to exist. So they're just so fucking weird and cool. And I think they make perfect sense with the moon because the moon can be this card of beautiful fantasy of different states of consciousness, but it can also be this card of nightmares, of illusions, of not really seeing things how they really are. So the moon is this whole spectrum of possibilities. Every card is, but yeah, so that's the moon. Okay. Oh my gosh, I hope we don't run out of time. I need to go faster. So we're almost done though. Okay, so the Fool reaches the sun, and now the Fool can see things clearly, can see things how they really are, the good, bad, and the ugly without judgment. So I shouldn't even say the good, bad, and the ugly because it's just this idea of, oh, did I skip? Oh my gosh, I skipped. Guys, I'm sorry. I am not on my game right now. We skipped over the star, but I have the imagery here for the star. I keep getting phone calls and everything's just chaos. It's just, I'm a fool on a journey, and a journey it is. Okay, so let's go back and let's talk about the star. I can't believe I blew over this one because this is another instance where I sometimes see a pair here between the tower and the star because there's such a chaotic energy in the tower where you reach the star and there's this idea of reprieve. It's a little bit dark to see this one, but the idea is it's this almost like you're camping and you're laying on your back and looking up at the star through these trees. So the star is a reprieve. The star is refilling your well, reconnecting to a sense of purpose, reconnecting to your North Star, what gives your life purpose, what gives your life meaning. Okay, sorry about that, guys. So now we have the sun. I'm trying to blast ahead of myself. Okay, so I already started to talk about this, but with the sun, the Fool can now see things clearly. There's a sense of acceptance of all that is without labeling it good or bad. It just is. something that I like in the imagery with the Spacious Tarot is there's also this invitation with the sun to open yourself up towards what feels warm, open yourself up towards liberation. Notice that when you are in your natural organic state of being, you naturally want to open to what is good for you, to what gives you life, to what infuses you with vitality, just like the sunflower follows the sun across the sky. Okay. With Judgment, there is an invitation to rebirth. A lot of decks now retitle this card to Awakening, which I actually really like. I like that title. This is the culmination of all of the lessons, all of the processes the Fool has encountered throughout the cards that we've gone through so far. The imagery in our deck is this idea that here's kind of this portal into another way of being, and it's a more purposeful way of being, it's a more integrated way of being, it's a more holistic way of being, and it's definitely, above all else, a more magical way of being. I've had a few people say that this card reminds them of The Wizard of Oz when the movie starts in black and white, and then Dorothy goes into Oz and everything's suddenly in color, and that's definitely something I think about with this card as well. I think that's a really good metaphor for opening up to a new, more magical, more sort of full, meaningful way of existing. That's what's happening with Judgment. Okay, and then of course we have the World, which is the culmination. We already talked about this one earlier, but there's this sense of integration and wholeness. So by integration, we talked earlier about some cards that form these kind of natural pairs, like way back with the Magician and the High Priestess. There's this idea of conscious awareness and unconscious awareness, active energy and passive energy. All of those things that seem like opposites are all reconciled and held together in the wholeness of the world. There's also an aspect in the world of being both in a cosmic consciousness. So this is another thing that was sort of serendipitous with the imagery in the Spacious Tarot that I didn't necessarily consciously think about, but I really like now. When we look back at the Judgment card, there's the portal here. And when I look at the World card, I feel like we're now inside of that portal, and that's all of this colorful energy surrounding us here. So this is this kind of cosmic consciousness, but this is the more sort of worldly consciousness, the journey that we've gone on in the earthly realm. And again, we have the spiral imagery in this card as well. So this is another reminder that this is a dynamic process. Something that Carl Jung said about individuation is that there is no finish line. So you can be in the process of, the world at the same time that you're still going through or maybe reverberating with some of the lessons of the earlier cards. It's a dynamic process. It's not about reaching the world and just you're there forever. There's a dynamic experience to this place of the world. All right, so I'm back to my face. I hope that some of that made sense, and I apologize that I kept getting phone calls and things it's a weird vibe today. It's like cloudy outside. I'm trying though. I'm a fool on my journey, just like we all are. So that is just a really quick synthesis, a really quick outline of some ways of thinking about the Fool's journey, and I used the Spacious Tarot as an example. So thank you guys for hanging out with me through that, and it took longer than I thought, but does anybody have any questions or any comments? I see a couple things. Someone says this card could easily be the Fool as well. So beautiful. Oh, I'm so glad you think that. Yeah, I think there's really that connection between those two cards, so I'm glad that comes through. One thing I'll share with you guys, a little Easter egg. This is a little hidden thing in the Spacious Tarot that not a lot of people know. It's probably hard to see here, but if you might be able to tell way at the center of this spiral. If you guys have this deck, get this card and look for yourself and you'll be able to see. There's a little teeny tiny pack. In the Waite-Smith Tarot, how the Fool has the pack with all their belongings in it. In our original version of the Fool, we were going to show the pack laying there on the cliff, and we ended up taking that out, but it's still in our world card. So there is a connection between the world and the Fool. Even in our imagery, you can see the Fool's little pack at the center of the spiral. That's a little Easter egg not many people know. Hidden treasure in the Spacious Tarot. Okay, let's see, what are our comments? I see some thank yous. You guys are so welcome. I appreciate you sharing that, especially since I feel like a bit of a dingle hopper today, so I'm glad that you guys enjoyed it. And let's see, what else? Someone asked, will it be shared? Yes, it will. For better or worse, this is going to live in infamy. It will be on my IGTV, and I'm also going to get it onto my YouTube channel as well. So if you missed it, you can re-watch it. People like the Easter egg. I'm so glad. It's fun. Okay. Yeah, I see some hearts, so thank you guys for that. Oh no, your internet cut out. It might be my internet. I think, yeah, it might be my internet because a couple people were having weird connection things, so we're doing what we can. Okay, do we have any questions? Are we doing good? Are we feeling okay? I would love to do something like this and maybe write about it or go through it in a recording where I can do some editing and kind of make it more cohesive, because I know I stumbled a few times. I tried to skip over the star, which is ironic as the star is one of my favorite cards. Someone says, you are a treasure, as is your work. Thank you. Oh, that's really sweet. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. When did you know you were ready to create a deck? Basically, the same thing happened to me when I knew I was ready to start learning tarot, which is Julia Cameron calls these intuitive hits marching orders, which is kind of a cheeky way of talking about it, but she'll say she gets these marching orders and I get them as well. And that's how I started learning tarot. I got a marching order out of nowhere that was like, you need to get a tarot deck. So I did. And then I'd been doing tarot professionally for several years, and I got a marching order, this little intuitive insight. I want to create a deck. I was actually out for a walk, which is when a lot of my intuitive impulses come, and it was raining, and it was like this really cool vibe, and you know the smell of rain. Oh, I love the smell of rain. And all of a sudden I was just like, I want to create a deck. And I want to do it with Annie because I already knew Annie. I've told this story before, but just really quickly, I hadn't reached out to Annie, but I had this idea and I wanted to do it. And then Annie reached out to me and said she wanted to create a deck with me. And I was like, oh my gosh, the universe wants this to happen because I already had this idea. I just hadn't taken action on it yet. I hadn't gone over the fool. I hadn't been the fool and just, pushed myself on the cliff. So Annie did that, and then we did it together. Okay. Let's see. Someone says do a course. I've been meaning to for so long. I've been meaning to do a course for so long. I need to just really do it. Thank you for encouraging me. I need the push again to kind of be the fool and go off the cliff. How is the awakening of judgment different than the rebirth of death? So this is just kind of my quick immediate impulse. I could probably think about this and go into a more concise answer, but I think about death more as, again, I shared that quote from Rachel Pollack, where death is the moment that you let go of the old masks. So death is more about subtraction to me. Whereas with judgment is about immersing yourself in something. Judgment is about going into a big sense of purpose. Not everyone likes the imagery in the Rider-Waite-Smith Tarot because it's kind of biblical with like the angel and the trumpets, bringing the people up from the dead or whatever. But there is that idea of opening up to purpose. So death is more about subtracting things that need to go, that are maybe getting in the way. And then judgment is like, what are you immersing yourself into now? I hope that makes sense. Your notes on the Wild Unknown was a game changer for me. That is amazing. I'm so glad to hear that. People still tell me that, and I wrote those posts in like 2015, so it's really cool that people are still referencing them, and it means a lot to me, so thank you so much for letting me know. Okay. Awesome. You guys, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for bearing with me in my humanness. I'm human, you're human. We're all just fools out here trying to do our thing, trying to do the best we can, trying to share the journey with each other. And I'm very honored to share this time with you today. If you were here live, thank you so much. If you watched the replay, thank you so much as well. I will be back next week for our third tarot gathering session, and I think it's going to be about reversals. We're going to talk about some ways of thinking about and working with reversed cards. Same time, same place, so I hope you guys will come back then. Someone says they agree about the Wild Unknown. That was their first deck. I was lost as a newbie, and that was amazing. Aw, that really means a lot to me. Thank you guys. I'm so glad that anything I do could be a little helpful, a little inspiring. Yes. Okay. All right, my dears. Take good care, and I hope to see you next week. And this is the part where I'm always like, how do I get out of the live? Okay, bye-bye.